Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Ben Jones, Product Development Specialist with Nasdaq Index Research. We're going to take a look at the cybersecurity space, discuss some of those threats and an index that can track it. Ben, it's great to have you with us. Welcome back to Trade Talks.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, and certainly there has been an increase in cyber threats. Let's discuss some of the things that we're seeing happening globally.
Yeah, it certainly is a global trend that we're seeing, right? Where cyber threats are taking place, pretty much in any country these days and affecting almost any type of business. And I think what's especially timely about this is that we've seen an increase in cybersecurity hacks and breaches, really since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Here's some just kind of bullet points of some headlines that we've been tracking here, and and how you can see it is, in fact, global. So in the U.S. alone, the FBI, their Internet Crime Complaint Center, received between 3,000 to 4,000 cybersecurity complaints daily in the midst of the pandemic. And normally they see only around 1,000, right? And this was reported back in April. But also you see an increase in cybersecurity breaches in the UK, right? Between February and March 2020, UK cyber attacks rose 37% month to month. In the midst of the crisis. And now you're seeing it permeating across different industries, right? If you look at just financial companies, right? The SEC released a letter just last week from the Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations, and they observed that there's been an apparent increase in sophistication of ransomware attacks on SEC registrants, which include broker-dealers, investment advisors, and investment companies. And probably anyone that's in tune with investing and is a professional probably meets some of those, is a registered SEC company most likely. So it's going to be impacting you, those of you that are listening, and also endpoint breaches. And I think this is really where it hits home and affects just the individual, right? The everyday person. 70% of breaches originate at endpoints. And that's even after there's been tons of spending on endpoint security. So what is endpoint security? So the endpoints are all the different devices that are connected to a network or network enabled, right? So think about servers, think about mobile devices like an iPad, think about computers or smartphones. And so, we're beginning to see that a lot of breaches really occur there, not on the whole network level, but on these individual devices. That's where a lot of these breaches originate. And so they're seeing an increase in that. And so that's why you've seen a lot of interest in cybersecurity, and you've seen a lot of interest in companies that provide these, cybersecurity services.
All right, Ben, and I want to take a look at your next two slides here where we learn about an index that tracks the companies where cybersecurity is a big part of their business, and then also talk about some of the cybersecurity fundamentals.
For sure. So one index that Nasdaq runs is the ISC Cybersecurity UCITS Index. This is an index that the LNG Cybersecurity UCITS ETF, iSpy, tracks. So this index provides investors with a way to track and access the cybersecurity thing, right? So anyone who is interested in, harnessing this trends, whether it's event driven or based off of these long-term economic trends that we're seeing kind of proliferate, this is one way to access it and track it ultimately. This index includes companies that are, service providers, right? Hardware, software developers for cybersecurity, as well as for cybersecurity businesses that directly provide cybersecurity services. And we kind of view it in two categories: infrastructure providers and service providers. So an infrastructure provider is a company that is a direct provider of hardware or software for cybersecurity, and where cybersecurity is a key driver of that business. On the other hand, the service provider component of this index are those that provide cybersecurity-based services, right? So one way to think about it is that cyber companies provide services that fall outside of that narrow definition of the infrastructure. Service providers typically conduct business securely, while the infrastructure providers provide the security itself. It's a long-winding way of saying that it's an index comprised of cybersecurity companies, but with unique view, whether it's infrastructure and service providers, which makes it different than some of the traditional cybersecurity indexes that are out there. And so when we think about this index and the methodology that it employs, we see that there are some float market capitalization screens. There's also some volume screens, but ultimately this delivers an index that allows you to really truly track this important theme. When you look at the constituents, right, because of the service and infrastructure screen, because of some of the other screens, we often find that this index is actually comprising kind of smaller to mid-sized companies than, let's say, most technology benchmarks, such as the Nasdaq Global Technology Index. What we believe is that, based off of research, this could portend to, higher growth in the future for some of these names that are growing. And that's what you see when you look at the fundamentals, right? So if you look at this index, based off of some recent research, and, we break down, kind of the different groups, whether it's the index itself or, the infrastructure components or the service components, and compare it to, let's say, the Nasdaq Global Technology Index, you see some interesting trends from a fundamental standpoint. For one, you see that the index itself, the components in general, are experiencing, higher average one-year net sales growth than, let's say, the technology benchmark. You're also seeing growth within, let's say, the service component side, where the service components, within this index have a higher net sales growth than, let's say, the infrastructure side. So you do see some attractiveness there, when we're thinking about kind of the overall top line growth, for these securities. The other point is the gross profit margin, right? So this is really getting to kind of the profitability of these constituents and how it's growing and how we see financial health here. Across the board, you see the infrastructure components has higher gross profit margin than let's say the average within the benchmark. You also see the service components have a higher gross profit margin than the benchmark, and even the index itself, the ISC Cybersecurity UCITS. So overall, you're seeing plenty of top line growth. You're seeing plenty of profitability, and this all leads to what we believe, based on the data, is a pretty fundamentally sound theme, as well as just a fundamentally sound index.
All right, Ben, we have another minute here. Let's just take a look at our last slide here with performance on the index itself and how it compares to some of the others.
Right. Thanks, Jill. So when you think about it, yes, it's great to, we see that cybersecurity is in the news. We know that the fundamental story behind it. But at the end of the day, what does performance look like, right? Well, performance is competitive. If you look at the last 3 months, the index is keeping up with, let's say, the benchmark, as well as the Nasdaq Composite. And, in fact, through yesterday was outperforming. You see it's come down a little bit, right? It was have a greater margin of outperformance, but it has cooled off. So it's up, let's say, 22%, the last 3 months versus, 21.33 for the Nasdaq Composite. If you go further back in time, we see that it's up about, 73% over the past 3 years versus, 65% for the Nasdaq Composite. It is trailing, let's say, the Nasdaq Global Tech benchmark up 78%. But overall, it is keeping up with the benchmarks. It is outperforming over this, short-term period. But as we continue to see the cyber threats increase, and the challenges that companies and individuals and government agencies are going to face, it's going to be an important theme going forward.
All right, Ben, great to have you with us. Thanks for joining me on Trade Talks.
Thank you.
All right, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.